That morning, a bright red paper was slapped across my front door. In bold letters, it screamed, "Delinquent." I stood there frozen as neighbors slowed their steps, whispering to each other, their eyes cutting through me like knives. Me, a man who paid every bill in cash, who built his life on honesty, who prided himself on a credit score above 800, now branded a fraud. The letter claimed I owed $60,000 on a credit card I had never even applied for. My name, my social security number, my signature twisted and stolen. In that moment, I felt stripped of everything I had worked for, not just my money, my dignity, my reputation. And yet, the real betrayal wasn't printed on that notice. It was sitting inside my own house. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the twists and turns of this story or the next one. On weekends, I often walked to the grocery store with an envelope of cash in my pocket. The clerks knew me as the man who never swiped plastic. I watched other customers tap their cards, phones, even watches, and I felt like a relic. Once an old friend from work teased me in front of the cashier, "Still hoarding pennies, Richard?" I just smiled because I knew every dollar I saved had a purpose. That night, Maria leaned across the table, eyes steady. "Grandpa doesn't waste money," she said firmly. "He just knows what matters." Her words melted the sting of the joke. In that moment, I realized she understood me better than most adults ever had. One evening, Clara offered to help me log into online banking. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, moving so quickly I couldn't even see what she was doing. When I leaned closer, she smiled too brightly and said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll handle it." Another night, as I walked past the kitchen, I heard her whispering on the phone. The words "credit line" floated out before she changed the subject the moment I stepped in. 1. 500. I've lived 62 years carrying the same habits. Quiet, simple, predictable. My neighbors would tell you I'm the man who still writes checks at the grocery store, who carries envelopes of cash to pay for everything from gas to utilities. They call me old-fashioned. Some even whisper the word cheap. But to me, discipline was never about being cheap. It was about pride. It was about control. I worked construction my whole life. Long days on scaffolding, steel boots on hot asphalt, calluses built so thick my hands could sand wood without splinters. I never earned much, but what I earned I kept clean. I saved. My proudest number wasn't my paycheck, it was my credit score, over 800. I guarded that score like some men guard their rifles. In America, your credit score is more than a number. It's your passport to dignity. With it, people treat you with respect. Without it, you're invisible, or worse, suspect. My wife, God rest her soul, used to tease me about my obsession with bills. "Richard, you count every cent like it's gold," she'd laugh. But she also knew I did it for us, for our boy Daniel. When cancer took her, Daniel was 20, and suddenly it was just me and him. Daniel never inherited my discipline. He was bright but restless, quick to chase what glittered. I watched him move from job to job, always with a new excuse. Then came Clara. She swept into his life like a storm, smiling, warm, smart. Too smart. She called me Dad from the beginning, cooked meals in my kitchen, even bought me a scarf one Christmas. But her eyes always drifted to my filing cabinet, to the drawer where I kept receipts and property papers. I noticed, though I said nothing. Neighbors said I was lucky. "Your son found a caring wife. She's modern, educated. She'll keep him steady." Maybe I wanted to believe that. Maybe I needed to. Because the truth was, Daniel was slipping. I'd catch late-night phone calls, his voice tense. I once found betting slips in his car numbers, circled in red ink. Sports betting. He swore it was harmless, just fun. I wanted to believe him. And then there was Maria, their little girl, my granddaughter, 12 years old, full of questions, full of light. If Daniel was my disappointment and Clara my suspicion, Maria was my redemption. She loved school, loved science. At dinner, she'd rattle off facts about volcanoes, about constellations. Her eyes lit up every time she spoke about space. I saw in her what I once saw in myself, a hunger to build, to reach higher. But Daniel and Clara never encouraged her. They bought her clothes, gadgets, but when she asked for a telescope to study the stars, Clara laughed. "We don't need to waste money on toys." I remember the way Maria's face fell, how she nodded quietly and went back to her homework. That night I sat awake, staring at my savings book. People thought I was stingy because I never upgraded my truck because I patched my boots instead of buying new. What they didn't see was that I saved for moments like this. A week later, I came home with a long box. Maria tore it open, and when she realized what it was, a real telescope, she gasped like she'd been handed the universe. That night, we set it up in the backyard. I adjusted the lens, my fingers stiff but steady, and guided her to Saturn's rings. See that not everything we're told to look at is all there is. Sometimes you have to look further. She hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack. "Grandpa, you really believe in me," she whispered. I just smiled. Months later, Maria took that telescope to her school's science fair. I stood in the back of the gymnasium, watching her in her school t-shirt beside a poster of galaxies she'd drawn herself. Kids crowded around, eyes wide. Teachers nodded in approval. When she won first place, I felt a lump rise in my throat. Pride, not the kind that comes from money or credit scores, but from knowing that my sacrifice gave a child a future. Of course, Clara was there too. She clapped, smiled, kissed Maria's head. But when her gaze swept across the gym, it landed on me. For a moment, her smile froze, her eyes sharp and calculating. That was the first time I felt it clearly. The warmth she showed was a mask. Life went on. I kept paying bills by hand, walking to the bank with checks, never once opening an online account. People urged me to sign up for credit monitoring services to track my report, but I brushed them off. That's just another monthly fee, I'd say. I know where every cent goes. I don't need some company to watch over me. Looking back, that stubbornness was the crack in my armor. And yet I had no reason to suspect danger. I was the man who built his life on discipline, on trust in numbers, on pride, and living debt-free. My neighbors joked, my son borrowed my daughter-in-law, smiled sweetly, and my granddaughter looked at the stars. It was a fragile balance. I didn't know then that someone I let into my home was already planning to turn all that discipline, all that pride, into a weapon against me. People call me cheap. They see the duct tape on my boots, the way I nurse a television older than some of my neighbors' marriages, and they whisper. But what they don't see are the reasons behind it. For me, saving isn't about hoarding. It's about making sure when sacrifice is needed, I can give it. I learned that rhythm early. Work earned, put it aside. My wife and I lived by envelopes, every dollar labeled before it ever left the bank. After she passed, I kept the habit. Some nights I still hear her voice humming over the checkbook pencil, tapping the margin. Daniel never inherited that discipline. My son had a restless streak. Jobs, hobbies, promises, they came and went like wind. I told myself he'd settle one day. Then Clara arrived, warm smile, quick words, always calling me Dad. Too smooth, if you ask me now. I'd catch her eyes lingering on my filing cabinet or hear her tone sharpen when she thought no one was listening. But back then I told myself I was imagining things. Maria, their little girl, became my refuge. At 12, she already knew more about the stars than I did. She'd sit at the diner, sketching constellations on napkins, explaining why the moon pulls the tides. When she asked her parents for a telescope, they brushed it off. "Waste of money," Clara said. Daniel just shrugged. That night I opened my ledger, rent, utilities, groceries, and a new line telescope. I cut corners quietly. Took a side job patching drywall on weekends, ate peanut butter sandwiches instead of hot meals. The telescope I bought wasn't the fanciest, but it was real, a proper instrument, not a toy. On Maria's birthday, I carried the long box into the yard. When she tore the paper and realized what it was, the sound she made, it wasn't a scream or a sob, more like a laugh folded into a gasp. We set it up that night. The air smelled of cut grass, the tripod cool under my hands. When Saturn came into focus, she pressed her eye to the lens until it left a red ring on her skin. "I can really see it," she whispered. "Grandpa, you believe in me." That telescope changed more than her nights. She built a project around it for the school science fair. I stood in the back of the gym, the floor shining with fresh wax, while she explained azimuth and altitude to a line of judges. Her voice never wavered. She won first prize. Teachers clapped, kids stared. I'll never forget the look on her face when they handed her the ribbon. Pride doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just fills your chest until breathing hurts. Clara clapped too, kissed Maria's cheek for the cameras. But I saw her glance toward the PTA treasurer's ledger, her eyes narrowing with a hunger I recognized. I told myself again, it was nothing. I wanted peace. That was my mistake. Neighbors still called me stingy because I patched boots and drove an old truck. They never saw the trifold poster board in the back seat or the telescope standing by Maria's window. They never saw the property tax bills I paid on time year after year. Saving wasn't about denying life, it was about protecting it. And Maria's belief in me was proof I was right. I thought that was enough. I thought living clean, paying every cent, and keeping my dignity would shield me. I didn't know someone already inside my home was planning to use that very discipline as a weapon. A few days later, I drove to the branch, my self-folder of receipts in hand. The lobby smelled of toner and disinfectant. When I reached the counter and explained the situation, the young banker frowned politely but pushed the screen toward me. "Sir, the system shows the account under your name and social security number. Our hands are tied." I pressed my palms against the desk. "Look at me. Do I look like a man who gambled away $60,000? Her lips pursed. The line behind me grew restless. A man coughed, and I caught the look in his eyes, pity mixed with suspicion. I left with the weight of those stares burning holes in my back. It wasn't just numbers on a screen anymore. It was judgment carved into every glance I met. Daniel sat rigid, sweat beading on his brow, his hands trembling. He opened his mouth, then shut it under Clara's sharp glance. Inside, he thought, I should stop this, but if I do, I'll lose her. I'll lose everything. 500. I thought I had seen the worst the world could throw at me. Accidents on job sites, winters so cold, the mortar cracked the silence of an empty bed after my wife passed. But nothing prepared me for the morning I opened that envelope. It was thick, the kind of envelope that already feels heavy with bad news. I slid it open with the edge of my pocket knife, expecting maybe a notice about insurance or property taxes. Instead, bold letters screamed across the top collection notice. Balance due, $60, $437.28. My hands went cold. I read it again, slower this time, mouthing each digit as if my tongue might catch the lie hiding inside. $60,000, a credit card balance. My name, my address, the last four of my social security number. I've never owned a credit card. Debit card, yes. Cash, always. But a credit card, not once in 62 years. The room tilted. My chair scraped the floor as I stood clutching the paper. Outside the window, I heard the neighbor's dog bark, and with it came another sound, a knock at the door. Sharp, businesslike. When I opened it, a man in a suit stood holding a clipboard. His tie was too tight, his eyes too tired. "Mr. Gomez," he asked, though he already knew. "We're here to discuss your outstanding balance." Behind him, Mrs. Harding from across the street paused on her morning walk. Her lips tightened. She slowed down just enough to hear. Two teenagers on bikes wheeled past, whispering, pointing at the bright red sticker the man pressed onto my doorframe. Delinquent. The word glared in the morning sun like a scarlet letter. I wanted to shout, "This isn't mine. You've got the wrong man." But the collector's pen was already scribbling notes, his car door already slamming. And the neighbors, I could feel their eyes like hooks in my back. I tore the sticker down, crumpled it in my fist until my knuckles whitened. But the damage was done. In a small town, shame travels faster than mail. I called the bank, my voice shaking with an anger I hadn't felt in years. After 30 minutes of menus and transfers, a woman finally answered. "Yes, Mr. Gomez, I see the account. Opened 2 years ago. Balance over 60,000. Payments late for several months." My throat tightened. I never opened that account. There was silence on the line, then the kind of sigh you hear from someone who doesn't believe you. "Sir, the account is in your name with your social security number. We have your signature on the application." "Send it to me," I said through clenched teeth. When the copy arrived by email, Clara had once insisted we set up an email for official things. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. The signature looked like mine, but crooked as if someone traced it from memory. The driver's license scan was smudged, edges warped. It carried my face, yes, but grainy like a photocopy of a photocopy. Legal enough to pass. Fake enough to damn me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept walking from the kitchen to the hallway, touching the walls as if the house might steady me. My credit score had been over 800, a badge I carried like a medal. Now, with one fraudulent account, it had plummeted to 520. In America, that number decides everything. At 800, people trust you. At 520, doors slam shut. I felt the weight of it the very next day. My truck needed new tires, and I drove to the rental counter to pick up a car for the week while the shop worked. The young clerk tapped at his computer, then looked at me with the kind of pity reserved for the fallen. "I'm sorry, sir. Your credit score doesn't qualify." My ears rang. Behind me, a couple waiting in line shifted, whispering. One of them chuckled. I wanted to grab the monitor, shove it in their faces, scream, "This isn't me." But instead, I felt my chest collapse inward. Walking out of that office head low, I caught a glimpse of a neighbor's car idling nearby. The driver, Kowalski, raised his eyebrows, muttered to his wife, "Guess we were wrong about him." That sentence cut deeper than the notice, deeper than the number on the paper. Wrong about me. As if my life's discipline, decades of sacrifice, could vanish with one rumor, one false line of credit. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the crumpled notice. The fridge hummed behind me, Maria's galaxy drawing still pinned under the tomato magnet. I thought of her, of the telescope in her room, of the way she looked at the stars as if they were promises. What would she think if she heard her classmates whispering that her grandfather was a cheat? The thought made my stomach twist. And yet part of me clung to hope. Maybe it was all a clerical error. Maybe some clerk would realize the photo ID was fake, the signature forged. I told myself that until the sun came up. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a stranger's doing. This wasn't random. Someone had walked into my life, taken my name, my number, my trust, and turned them into a weapon. And that someone was closer than I wanted to believe. Conflict. Part 2. Dawn 302. I didn't have to look far for answers. They were sitting at my own dinner table. The night after the notice, I laid the papers flat on the wood, smoothing the creases with my palms. Clara poured iced tea into glasses like it was any other evening. Daniel picked at his food, eyes darting everywhere but the documents in front of him. Maria chewed in silence, sensing the storm. I tapped the page. Does anyone want to explain why my name is on a $60,000 credit card balance? Clara's eyes widened, but only for a fraction of a second. Then came the practiced smile, the one she used on neighbors, teachers, anyone she wanted to charm. "Dad, oh my goodness, you must be confused. Remember when I helped you with some paperwork a while back? You needed an easier way to pay for groceries and things online, so I filled out a credit card application for you, just to make things simpler." Her voice was syrupy, almost maternal, but her words rang hollow. I slammed my palm on the table. Simpler, I never asked for a credit card. I never signed anything. And this, I shoved the forged ID toward her. "This isn't mine." Clara leaned back, feigning innocence. "Well, maybe you forgot. It happens. You've got so much on your plate. I only wanted to help." The room fell into a silence thick enough to choke. Maria stared at her plate. Daniel fiddled with his fork. My blood pounded in my ears. "Help," I spat. "You call it help when you forge my name, when you steal my social security number." Clara's lips pressed together. For a flicker of a moment, the mask slipped. Her eyes sharpened, calculating, then softened again when Maria looked up. "Dad," she said gently, "let's not make a scene. We're family." Family. The word tasted like rust in my mouth. I turned to Daniel. "And you, do you know about this?" He froze. His shoulders hunched like a boy caught sneaking out past curfew. For a second, I almost believed he'd deny everything. But then his voice cracked. "Dad, I used it. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could pay it back." The room spun. "You... what?" He swallowed hard. Eyes glued to the table. "I had some debts, sports bets. I thought if I just covered them, I could win it back. Pay off the card and no one would know. Clara said it was just temporary." My chest tightened. "Sports bets. Daniel, you risked my name, my reputation, everything I worked for on a game." He buried his face in his hands. Clara reached for his shoulder, but he shrugged her off. "I'm sorry, Dad. I swear I'll fix it." "Fix it." The number 60,000 glared back at me from the papers. My credit score, once my pride was shattered. My neighbors thought I was a fraud. And now the truth sat here at my table. My son and his wife had carved my name open like a carcass and feasted on it. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching on the tile. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what this means? I can't rent a car. I can't get insurance. My dignity gone. And for what? So you could gamble." Daniel's voice was small, almost childlike. I didn't think it would spiral this far. Clara placed her hand on his arm again, but her eyes never left mine. Cold, steady, almost daring me. I felt the walls closing in. Even Maria's breathing sounded heavy. She looked between us, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The next day at school, she paid the price too. She came home with her cheeks blotchy, eyes swollen. "They said you're broke, Grandpa," she sobbed. "They said you owe everybody money." I knelt beside her, holding her small hands. "Maria, listen to me. I'm not a debtor. I never borrowed a cent on that card. Do you believe me?" She nodded fiercely, tears streaking her cheeks. "I always believe you." That broke me more than the notice, more than the shame. A child should never have to defend her grandfather against lies spun by his own family. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazy circles. My wife's words echoed. "Be the anchor for your son, even if he drifts. But what do you do when the anchor is the very thing dragging you under?" I wanted to storm into the bank, pound the counter, demand justice. I wanted to drag Daniel and Clara into the street, show the neighbors the truth. But instead, I sat in silence, teeth grinding, blood simmering. And then a thought. If Clara was bold enough to fake my signature, to use my social security number to build an empire of lies on my back, what else was she willing to do? The realization chilled me. This wasn't just debt. This was fraud. This was betrayal with teeth. If your own daughter-in-law admitted she opened a card in your name, would you swallow it to keep peace, or would you stand up knowing it might tear your family apart? Sometimes I'd walk through the house and run my hand along the walls, remembering the day I bought it, cash, no mortgage. Back then I was proud. This was a home no bank could ever take from me. Now to be called a debtor under this very roof felt like mockery. I stood before the framed photo of my wife, her smile frozen in time. "Would you forgive them?" I whispered. "Or would you fight?" The silence gave no answer, only the creak of the house settling. But I felt her eyes on me, urging me not to let go of the truth. If you were in my shoes, would you stay silent to keep the family together? Or would you stand up, even if it meant losing them? Tell me, what would you do in 500? I used to believe dignity was something you could lock away, like a deed in a fireproof box. Keep it safe, guard it well, and it would be yours forever. But after that night at the table, Clara's syrupy lies, Daniel's trembling confession, I realized dignity isn't a document. It's a fragile rumor the world agrees to believe about you. And once that rumor changes, even the truth can't catch up fast enough. Everywhere I went, I saw it in people's eyes. At the grocery store, the cashier's smile a little tighter, as if she knew something about me that I didn't. At the bank, the teller avoided eye contact when she handed back my withdrawal slip. On my own street, neighbors slowed their steps when I waved their conversations, dropping a few decibels until I passed. I told myself it was all in my head. But then I'd see the glue mark on my front door where the red delinquent sticker had been torn away. The paper was gone, but the outline remained a pale square that mocked me every morning. For 62 years, I paid my way. I patched boots instead of buying new. I ate sandwiches when money was thin. I refused debt, not because I feared interest, but because I feared shame. And now here I was, branded with both. At night, I'd sit in the kitchen with the lights off, just the hum of the refrigerator for company. Maria's galaxy drawing was still pinned under the tomato magnet. She had written, "To Grandpa, who sees the stars even when it's cloudy." I stared at that line until the words blurred. She believed in me. She still did. But what about everyone else I thought about? Daniel, my boy, my blood. He had once fallen asleep in my arms with dirt on his cheeks from playing soccer in the yard. Now his hands were dirty with debts, with lies, with signatures that weren't his to sign. I remembered the way my wife had whispered in the hospital bed, breath, shallow eyes fixed on me. Don't let him drift. Be his anchor. But what happens when the anchor drags the ship under? I closed my eyes and remembered the smell of the construction site, the dust, the hot steel, the taste of sweat trickling down my lips. Hard work had never scared me. I could face the sun, the cold, the ache of muscles that refused to quit. But this being called a debtor, a fraud, that was a weight I didn't know how to lift. I saw my reflection in the kitchen window, ghosted against the dark yard. The man staring back looked older than I remembered, shoulders sagging, eyes tired, mouth turned down at the corners. A man who had spent his whole life keeping receipts neat in envelopes, only to have his reputation shredded by people who shared his last name. One morning, I reached for the property tax bill pinned to the fridge. Crisp official paid in full. My check had cleared weeks earlier, just like every year before. I held it up, felt the weight of the paper between my fingers. I paid every cent on time, I muttered. And now they call me a debtor. The words burned. I thought of Maria again. How she had come home from school with her cheeks wet, whispering, "They said you're broke, Grandpa, but I know it's not true." She had slipped a folded note into my lunch bag the next day. "Grandpa, I believe you. I found it at the job site tucked between my sandwich halves." My hands shook as I read it. Her faith was the only rope keeping me from free fall. But faith is not enough in a world of numbers. Banks don't care about loyalty. Credit scores don't measure honesty. A man can tell the truth for 6 decades and still be branded a liar in a single day. I sat at the table weighing my choices like bricks on a scale. If I stayed silent, I would keep the family intact, or at least the illusion of it. No police reports, no courtrooms, no headlines. Just me bearing the weight of Clara's crime and Daniel's weakness. But could I live that way? Could I walk into the diner, see the waitress whisper to her coworker, and know I'd chosen to let the lie stand? Or I could fight. Stand up, drag the truth into the light, prove I wasn't a debtor, that I had been betrayed. But in doing so, I'd rip my family apart. Daniel would face humiliation, Clara worse. Maria would be caught in the crossfire, her parents at war with her grandfather. I pressed my palms into my eyes until stars danced in the darkness. What kind of man chooses between honor and blood? Thought about silence. They say silence is golden. But in this case, silence felt like rust eating through me. I remembered something my father once told me when I was young and poor and ashamed to ask for a loan to fix my first truck. Son, debt isn't just money. It's someone else owning your name. Now my name was owned, twisted, printed on a fraudulent card, swiped at casinos I'd never set foot in. I clenched my fists. Maybe it was time to stop being quiet. Maybe it was time to speak louder than the lies. And let me ask you now, listening to my story, what do you think? Is silent strength a way of protecting family? Or is it weakness that lets betrayal grow roots? If you were in my chair, staring at bills you'd paid on time all your life, would you swallow the shame or would you fight? That question haunted me. I asked it of the ceiling at night, of the mirror in the morning, of the stars through Maria's telescope when she wasn't looking. And every time the silence gave me the same answer, silence would bury me. Silence was eating me alive. Every night I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing my wife's voice like a ghost in the room be his anchor. But anchors aren't meant to drown, and I knew if I stayed quiet, this fraud would bury me before the ground ever did. So one morning I gathered every paper I had, the collection notices, the blurry ID copy, the crumpled envelopes, and I walked into a law office downtown. The place smelled of coffee and old carpet. The receptionist gave me the kind of polite smile you give someone who looks lost. But when I laid the stack on the lawyer's desk, his eyes sharpened. "This," he said, tapping the fake ID, "is fraud. Plain and simple. We'll bring in the bank's fraud department, but you'll need to give us everything proof you weren't the one using that card." For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt something steady under my feet. Someone believed me. I drove straight from his office to the construction site where I'd worked the last 2 years. The foreman, a man with skin leathered by sun and years, clapped me on the back. "You've been on this site almost every day. I'll vouch for you." He signed off on my time card, stamped them official. Then we checked the cameras. Grainy footage, but there I was, hard hat on, hauling lumber at 8:03 a.m. On the same morning, the credit card was used to withdraw cash at an ATM in Las Vegas, 2 states away. The timestamp glowed on the screen like a lifeline. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. "There," I whispered. "There's the truth." We sent it all to the bank's fraud department, the time cards, the footage, sworn statements from supervisors. I thought maybe that would be enough. But justice in America is never simple. While I waited, the humiliation didn't stop. One afternoon, I came home to find another slip stuck to my door. This one shouted "Final Notice" in block letters, red ink again like blood. Neighbors slowed as they walked past, shaking their heads. Mrs. Harding muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Shame, isn't it?" He always seemed so responsible. I ripped the paper down, but the sting stayed. I wanted to shout, "I have proof I'm not guilty." But in this town, evidence doesn't travel as fast as gossip. I sat on the porch that night, the smell of cut grass and diesel drifting from the road, and clenched the notice in my hand until it tore. I told myself, endure. The truth is coming. A week later, the fraud department called me in. A man in a gray suit slid a file across the table. "Mr. Gomez, we've reviewed your evidence. It lines up. The transactions clearly occurred when you were working elsewhere." Relief washed over me like rain after drought, but then he leaned forward. "There's more. Our system uses voice authentication for activating new accounts. Each call is logged and compared to your voice print." I frowned. Voice print? He explained it like I was a child. The bank had recorded my voice years ago when I verified security questions. Now, every new account activation required a match. The account in question had been activated by phone. He pressed a button and a recording played. A voice, deep deliberate, said, "This is Richard Gomez. Yes, I authorize." The hairs on my neck stood. It was not me. The cadence was wrong. The vowels stretched strangely. Then he played the analysis. The system highlighted mismatches, pitch rhythm, resonance. The conclusion glared in bold letters, "Not a match." And then he said the words that sealed it. "Mr. Gomez, the speaker, was female. Someone altered her tone to mimic a man. But technology doesn't lie. This wasn't your voice." For a moment the room tilted again. Female. My mind went straight to Clara, her voice sweet when she wanted, sharp when she didn't. I remembered the countless times she offered, "Let me make that call for you, Dad. Save you the trouble." My stomach turned. The betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It had fingerprints. It had sound waves. I sat back staring at the table. Relief and rage twisted together until I didn't know which was heavier. Relief that I finally had proof. Rage that it had come to this, that my daughter-in-law had worn my voice like a mask and stolen my name. The man in gray said, "This will hold up in court, but it may take months. Be patient." Patience. A word I'd lived by all my life. Waiting for paychecks, waiting for walls to cure, waiting for kids to grow. But patience now felt like salt on an open wound. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house creaked, the fridge hummed, the stars outside winked like they knew a secret. Maria's telescope sat in the corner of her room, angled toward the window. I looked through it just once and saw Saturn's ring again, thin, eternal, indifferent. And I whispered into the night, "I will clear my name, even if it costs me the family I thought I had." The courtroom itself was alive with tension. Wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward. I could hear the shuffle of papers, the faint scratch of pens from reporters in the back row. Every time my name was spoken, heads turned as though the words themselves carried weight. I felt their eyes on me, some skeptical, some curious, some quietly rooting for me to fall. Clara sat stiffly, arms crossed, her face pale, but eyes blazing. When the judge asked for her response, she leaned forward, voice cutting. "He's old. He doesn't remember things clearly. You can't trust his memory." Her words sliced through the room, and for a second I felt the sting. But then the bank's attorney pressed a button. The recording of the voice authentication played, echoing around the chamber. The analysis followed, cold, precise, undeniable. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't even a man's. Clara shrank back, her argument collapsing under the weight of fact. Daniel shifted beside her, sweat shining on his temples. He whispered harshly, not caring who heard, "Stop, Clara. It's over." His voice cracked with guilt, with shame. For once he sounded like the boy I had raised, not the man lost in her shadow. When the judge finally declared me innocent, the room erupted in sound, not cheers exactly, but the collective release of breath. A few neighbors clapped softly. Reporters raised cameras, flashes bursting like tiny fireworks. From the back, someone said clearly, "So he was innocent all along." That murmur spread like wildfire through the gallery. I straightened my shoulders. The humiliation I had carried like a stone in my chest felt lighter. This was no longer just my victory, it was the community's acknowledgement that the scarlet letter had never belonged to me. For months they had seen me as guilty. Now they saw the truth with their own eyes. Even as I stood taller, I knew this victory came at a cost. Clara glared at me with a hatred colder than stone. Daniel's head hung at his shoulders, trembling, and Maria clutched my hand, whispering, "I knew it, Grandpa. I always knew it." That moment mattered more than the gavel, more than the score restored. It was my redemption made visible. From the gallery, I heard whispers ripple like wind through grass. Neighbors who had once turned away were here along with a local reporter scribbling furiously. When the judge declared me innocent, someone murmured, "So he was innocent all along." And the word spread like fire. Walking out, flashes popped from cameras. For once, I didn't bow my head. Later, when I pinned my restored credit score on the door, a boy from across the street tugged his mother's sleeve. "So he's a good man?" he asked. She nodded, eyes meeting mine. That nod meant more than any gavel strike. It meant the neighborhood finally saw me again. Clara finally snapped, her voice icy. "You think this changes anything? You'll always be the old man clinging to receipts." The courtroom stared. For once, even Daniel flinched at her cruelty. Clara fell silent under the weight of their eyes. Daniel suddenly dropped to his knees in front of me, tears streaking his face. "It was her idea, but I let it happen. I betrayed you," he sobbed, voice cracking. The courtroom gasped. My chest tightened as I looked down at my only son, a man broken by his own weakness, yet finally honest for the first time in years. From the back rows, a murmur spread. A couple of neighbors and even a local reporter had been watching. "So he was innocent all along," one whispered loud enough for me to hear. I lifted my head, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight ease off my shoulders. My dignity wasn't just restored on paper, it was restored in the eyes of the community. 870 courtrooms have a smell, old wood polish paper and nerves. When I walked in that morning, my legs felt heavier than steel beams. I clutched the folder my lawyer gave me, though the real weight wasn't paper. It was 62 years of a life lived clean, now dragged through the mud. The judge called my name. I raised my hand, swore to tell the truth. My voice shook, not from fear of lying. I had nothing but the truth, but from the fear no one would believe it. The bank's attorney laid out their case, first pointing to documents. Signatures, account histories. Then came the evidence we'd gathered, my time cards, the job site footage, the mismatch in voice authentication. Finally, they produced the application packet. The driver's license scan was shown on a large monitor. Even from across the room, I could see how grainy it was, how the numbers were off, how the edges blurred like someone had dragged a photocopy across sand. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "this is the identification used to open the account. It bears Mr. Gomez's name, but..." He turned to the witness stand. "Mr. Walters, you were the notary on file." The notary was an older man, hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "Yes," he whispered. "Did you witness Mr. Gomez sign these papers?" His face drained. "No. I was fooled. The documents looked real enough. The woman was convincing. I thought," he shook his head, "I thought I was doing my job." A ripple went through the courtroom. I didn't look at Clara, but I could feel the heat of her silence beside Daniel. The judge leaned forward. "This court finds that the credit account was opened fraudulently. Mr. Richard Gomez bears no responsibility for the debt. The balance is void. His credit status shall be restored." My knees nearly buckled. The gavel struck wood, a sound sharp enough to split the last of my despair. Outside, the air felt different, lighter though the sky was gray. My lawyer handed me a printout, my new credit score 805. I stared at it the way a man stares at a sunrise after weeks of storms. I walked home and pinned that score right on the front door, over the pale scar where the red notice once clung. By evening, neighbors passed, pausing to read. "Mr. Kowalski muttered this time with a chuckle. Guess we were wrong about him. It should have felt like victory. And in some ways it did. My name was mine again, but victories in court don't heal the wounds at home. Maria rushed into my arms when I stepped inside. Her cheeks were wet. "I always believed in you, Grandpa," she whispered, voice fierce through the tears. Behind her, Daniel's shoulders slumped. He sank to his knees, head bowed. "Dad, please, forgive me." His words cracked like a child begging not to be punished. I looked at him, at Clara standing stiff with her arms crossed, eyes still calculating even in defeat. My heart wanted to answer, to reach back in time to when Daniel was small and innocent, but my mouth stayed shut. Instead, I turned toward the window, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. My voice came low, bitter, final. "My dignity, I've kept that. But family, I don't know if there's anything left to save." The room fell into silence. Maria's hand clutched mine. Daniel's sobs filled the corners, and Clara said nothing at all. And now I ask you listening here, if your own blood used your name, your trust to destroy your honor, would you forgive them? Or would you fight to the end, no matter the cost? Tell me what you'd do, and don't forget, like this video, share it and subscribe, because the next story might just be the one you never thought could happen in your own home. Thank you for watching.